Therapy Geeks, a free podcast by Luke McGibbon and Louise Taylor. I know people are saying that things like, not everything's going to change just because it's a new year. And the thing is, I don't think anyone believes that in the first place. I think they're just relieved that some passage of time has been marked. You know what I mean? That there's been something has happened. People want something to happen.
Yeah, people in their posts about 2020. 2020, you can. Oh, somebody wrote, 2020, your mum's calling.
Yeah.
Go away and don't come back. Jog on 2020. They don't like it at all. Yeah. Not a year.
Yeah, people get a bit of a slagging, I think, for attaching negative events to a year as if the year caused it. But again, I don't think people thought the coronavirus happened because it was 2020. People are just excited at the prospect of change, whether it's arbitrary or not. What I'm trying to say is, let people have something nice. Internet, why can't the internet let people have nice things like the change of a year? We've got the 4-second delay again, by the way, listeners. So I'm going to try and edit that out, but it might be a little clunky. But we're talking about grief today, just a little bit more because we, to be frank, we're covering it a little bit again because the last episode about grief had the most listeners that we've ever had, and I felt like we have a little bit more to talk about. I think we're both afraid we're going to repeat ourselves because we made the very rudimentary error back to the old episode. So this might just be a full duplicate of the last one.
I find it really, what is it? I find it hard to celebrate how much the episode of grief resonated with people.
Yeah.
Yay!
Talking about the miserable subject and getting the most listens. I know there's maybe a cynical part of me that thinks you fucking people, you want the sad shit. All right, well, here's the sad shit. But yeah, I think I know from my memory we talked at some length about, I guess, the Bobby story.
We're gonna give you loads more of it.
Yeah, there was the Bobby story funeral in Northern Ireland. And then there was talk about rituals from that and about how funerals are important for that sort of thing. And then I can't remember what else. We talked about different models of grief. So there's Kubler-Ross, which I think any therapist and their mum is sort of looking to put behind them. The old Kubler-Ross, what is it, 7 stages of grief? 5 stages? I should definitely know this, but
I thought it was 5.
Yeah, I think
but I think it's 7. Let's see.
I think it's 7. No, I think it is 5, but I think I've said 7 because I like the idea of some mystique. Like there's a secret stage of grief. Like there's a hidden track at the end of the album of grief. But then the hidden tracks are always a bit... There's a reason.
Right. It says 5 here in Wikipedia.
Okay.
So that must be right.
Happy days. And what have we
Wikipedia. Pardon?
What are they again? Off the top of my head. Call myself.
Oh, right. Okay. Go through a series of 5 emotions. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance.
Okay. And I guess, there's a pretty basic ass comparison you could make from those 5 stages to how people have reacted to various lockdown things, haven't they? Denial, there's the big one.
Yeah.
Everyone's felt anger. Bargaining. I don't know about bargaining. Maybe I'll wear my mask if you let me out. What's the other 2? Acceptance. That's the one everyone struggles with, isn't it?
Would the bargaining be the protest?
Yes. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Well, it's kind of what do you mean, like the BLM,
so it would be
the anti-mask protest.
Well, that was definitely the Black Lives Matter's definitely connected to grief. And the recent protests about what happened in Dublin recently, which was really tragic, that's connected with, and there's a lot, those are very raw emotions. But I was thinking more like anti-maskers or anti-vaccine and people like that. There's this real fear about freedoms and our human rights and our freedoms, and they're being removed, and my body and distrust. So this is it all connected to grief actually, when you think, because we were saying about grief and loss, but also the desire to have control over our lives and control over events.
Yes. Well, yeah, because grief is kind of the ultimate uncontrollable event, isn't it? And you know, it's kind of what a lot of people come to counselling or therapy for, isn't it? Really, they come for something that's currently out of their control. Yeah, I don't know. I guess you're right. Like, there's so many questions there, because there's you raised quite a few things that are worth exploring. I think, like, well, BLM being about grief, which it undoubtedly is. You know, it's a kind of cultural grief, isn't it? It's not just about lives lost. It's also about shock. It's about families. It's about potential futures that have been impacted by government action or inaction. It's grief about, in America in particular, because, you know, America is the home of racism, so to speak. But you know, in America, it's like, it's almost grief about stuff like Jim Crow, which you know, there just isn't enough acknowledgement that how recent that was. You know, like, because people say, you know, well, you're not slaves anymore, and you had a black president, so racism is effectively over. And it's just not the case when there's people who have like live grandparents who were affected by Jim Crow. And if you know, like, that's a generation ago. That is not that long ago. Like, stuff that happened a generation ago, of course it affects you now. Like, so of course people are still feeling the effects of Jim Crow. Like, it's because it affected the circumstances into which people were born. So yeah, I guess there is a kind of a sort of cultural grief there that is being, and you know, you could argue that protests are a form of bargaining. They're saying, like, this is a real problem, and how can we work together to deal with this, you know? Like, and then from that process came slogans and ideas like defunding the police, which I think is maybe a bit of an unwise way of wording a much simpler proposal, which was, you know, about having like qualified social workers in police departments instead of just sending out a dude with a gun to sort out a family problem, you know, things like that. But anyway,
like defunding the police. Most people don't understand defunding the police. They think, like, they think of the extreme, because it's quite a complex a request that people are trying to make it very simplified. And that's the problem. That's the other problem, I think, with information at the minute, trying to get information to a lot of people. People want quick information, and they want to process it quickly. So they want, like, you know, taglines are very, very, whereas sometimes you need a bit more substance, you need a bit more information before you truly understand it.
Yeah. Wouldn't it be
great? That's something that I just don't, what?
Sorry, this is the delay. I just thought, you know, wouldn't it be great if they did away with headlines? You know what I mean? They just, like, they gave a category of what the story is about and a clue, like a BuzzFeed headline, instead of saying, you know, just the headline, which is what people judge it on, and neglects nuance and detail. If it was more phrased as, like,
yes,
this guy was stopped by the police, what happens next will shock you, and then that's the story of George Floyd. I don't know. Like, that's a bad example, because I don't, like, the nuance just is kind of needed. The nuance isn't necessarily needed. You know, I feel like the information necessary about George Floyd and what happened could be given in a headline, that something unjust happened and a man died and was effectively killed by somebody in a position of authority, you know, who didn't need to kill him. Like, that's maybe a long headline.
but this is, and I think this is really, really interesting in terms of how societal, cultural, international issues affect us fundamentally on a psychological and personal level. do you know what I mean? And it affects how we engage with other people and who we connect with and who we can discuss things with and who we feel safe being ourselves with for our beliefs. Because I would be somebody who likes asserting myself and likes saying what I think. And we were talking about this. I've recently had an Asperger's diagnosis, ASD diagnosis. So I'm aware that the way my cognitions, my thoughts would be very different to a lot of people. And the way I process information is very different. But that doesn't mean I think I'm wrong and I need to be like other people. It means I'm aware that there's a difference in the way that I view the world to most of the people around me, maybe in Mid-Ulster more, you know what I mean? I was talking about, I got this diagnosis because of where I live, fundamentally because of the levels of discrimination I'd experienced from being different here. I didn't need it in Brighton. I didn't need it when I lived in America. I didn't feel I needed it when in Japan. But since I've been here for nearly 7 years, I'm like, yeah, very aware I'm different. I'm very aware it makes me vulnerable. But what I'm coming back to is, I think that when something shocking happens and you form your views and your opinions and your beliefs, sometimes the more traumatic and shocking it happens, sometimes the stronger the beliefs, which means the greater for the clashes, the greater ability for conflict, for societal unrest, for the threat of violence to erupt. And that, I think, is something that has been simmering for a lot of 2020. This real anger towards people who do not have the same beliefs.
Yeah. And to me, from what you say, the enemy is really certainty. You know, to me that's always the enemy. That's always the biggest problem with human nature, is like, first of all, that we demand it, and second of all, that we project it out into the world where it doesn't exist. So, like, you know, clashes of ideas like you're talking about come from people who are certain, and, you know, maybe neither side should be certain. There's always finer details that negate sort of broad brushstroke judgments about things.
Yes.
Yeah, I guess I think I've always had a thing against the idea of certainty, because I try not to speak with certainty about things that I'm not certain about. You know, it's kind of and a lot of problems, I think, you know, like people who like would preach hellfire or preach religious judgment, you know, that comes from like a place of certainty, that they're certain that this guy's going to go to hell, or like they're certain that this guy is the downfall of society based on their own reading of something that is uncertain, you know, and that frustrates me. I guess it's sometimes done in an effort to control as well, isn't it? Which is kind of what we were talking about in terms of grief. I suppose bringing it back to personal grief, what is there that one can control about personal grief?
Personal grief, and what can one control?
Because we've established...
I think...
Sorry, just a delay again.
I think people are scared of emotions. So grief is scary. That's the other thing, I think, because my research, so I'm doing all this in 2020 and got my diagnosis all whilst doing a PhD on nature and mental health, which like is flying, like I'm loving it, right? I think that this society celebrates people being not emotive, not being emotional. It celebrates people just getting on, like, you know, like saying, oh, they're all clapping for people doing the NHS, and oh yeah, they're all heroes for going to work, right? They're all getting paid, it's their job, right? And it's heroing people to do things, to just get on with it no matter what. And I would say that's quite unhealthy, that you're heroing people to put their lives at risk for a job. In many ways, a society is celebrating people, I don't know, for their ability to just sacrifice for the greater. I don't know what I'm trying to say, or what was I'm trying to say. I find it really interesting looking at what people celebrate in terms of behaviors. The general, not everybody, because I don't celebrate a lot of this. A lot of this, I think, is insane behavior, right? Just being told what to do by a crazy prime minister. And actually, I believe you need to think about people and you need to follow the science. But if you're trusting the government, you're you haven't been paying attention for centuries. You need to do a little bit of history. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So when we deal about something like grief, open displays of emotion and crying and really processing those emotions is not something that we're taught. It's not something that we're really allowed to do. That's why we talked about the ceremonies, the funerals and all that there. But I actually think people should be allowed to talk about their feelings a lot more and cry. You know what I mean? Like, if somebody, and they should be allowed to talk about their loved ones, and they should be allowed to talk about the good and the bad of their loved ones, who've passed and all that there. And they should be allowed to just talk and cry and express themselves. And if that involves anger, people are very scared of people being like verbally expressed in anger. But that's part of the grief. It's to allow people to process. Now, I don't think the way people process on social media is proper processing. I don't think that's processing, to be honest.
No, I think there's an element of processing to it, but it's not a particularly powerful one. I don't think it gets things out in the same way. I'm all for writing. I think really writing's really important, but there's nothing quite the same as pen to paper stuff. Like there's some benefit I think to typing something, but I think the physical act of writing is important. The gesture of it.
Yeah, and also acceptance that everybody is different in how they grieve. So for instance, a lot of people may do their grieving coming up to a death, coming up to something, and then once that person's passed, they may come to a place of acceptance quite quick than others. Everybody's so different, and I think it's all down to beliefs. It is, what are your beliefs on death? What are your beliefs on the relationship? That's what I think affects how you come to terms with it.
Yeah, well, this is it. Yeah, it's about because it's not just about come to terms with somebody being lost. It's also about what that person was to you and what you were to that person. The grief is sort of a portrait around these things. It's not just the loss of a person. There's sort of more to it than that. Do you think grieving is like a skill?
A skill?
Yeah.
No. I think grieving is, like I say, it's about beliefs. But if you look, there was something I was watching about Indigenous cultures. Andy Fisher it was, or something, because I'm doing about eco-psychology and radical eco-psychology. And they were saying that in some cultures, they don't actually believe in the past or the future, right? They just believe in them, and they don't talk about it. They just talk about the now. They're constantly in the now. How would you grieve in a culture like that?
Wow. I mean,
yes.
I mean, maybe that's the way everyone should grieve anyway, like there was a TED Talk I was listening to that was kind of about that, it's a TED Talk by, I'll get the name rather than just not credit them. Ashley Jones, How We Heal in Grief, TEDx Chattanooga, but home of the choo choo. But yeah, she was talking about how that, like, to her, grief became like a process, and a lot of theorists kind of agree with that it's natural, that like this is something you see in the animal kingdom. You see animals mourning and grieving too, that it's best when it's sort of like allowed to happen. And part of that is being in that here and now, and because like a knowledge of the past isn't necessary for you to be feeling pain in that moment. Even if you're living moment to moment, there is still pain in that grief, I think, because in that moment there is awareness of absence. Does that make sense?
Yes. But then they'd be connected very strongly to attachment and your beliefs. So again, right, so if you believe that that this is it, you've one life, no soul, met this amazing person, that's it, never again. You're going to grieve in a very different way as if you're spiritual and you believe that you'll be connected for eternity. Like, it's going to be different. If you believe that they're still around you, if you believe that signs are there in nature with robins or feathers or all of those, there's going to be a different quality to the grief than if you just think that's it, boom, done.
Right. Yes.
No?
That is, yeah.
So they all impact.
it's more complex than it seems on the outside. I quite like the idea, and it's in sort of Gestalt, I suppose, about unfinished business being a big part of grief. That like it's about something incomplete, an incomplete cycle of something. Something I would sometimes use with clients would be sentence stems. So it's like a little homework maybe that I give people, and it's just incomplete sentences about what you would say to that person. So it's I wish ... I should have ... I shouldn't have, I would or could have if only, and finally why ... for like people to try and complete the cycle of what they would try and communicate to the lost loved one, because like part of that stuckness in grief can be from feeling that there's something incomplete about your interaction with them.
You regret.
Oh yeah.
Regret, shame.
Aye.
Also, this is a huge one. Romanticizing relationships is incredibly problematic.
Yeah, and we can do that in breakups too, can't we? Not just grief. That like a past partner can seem like they were the best one in the world, or like the worst one in the world too. These are ways of getting away from the accurate feeling by expanding feelings, saying that this person was the best in the world and they were always amazing, and that means that I'm nothing, of course, without them, because they were class.
You look at like Only the Good Die Young. Like what is that? Like Only the Good Die Young.
Yeah.
Then there's a lot of old people who seem to be really good who seem to have died, but that's a saying that when somebody young dies, only the good die young. And you're like, wow, that's quite strong.
And like, I see what you're getting at more now than I did a minute ago, because what I'm hearing from there is that like one of the really difficult things about grief, and I'm probably repeating myself because I probably talked about this in the last one, but anger, unacknowledged anger, and there doesn't have to be a rational reason for it. You could just be angry that they're gone. You could be angry that they died, and that is so hard to own and feel and accept, because it's not seen as socially acceptable, because you've got to be romanticizing this amazing person that your mum or dad or partner was, that like you could be pissed off. They could have left you with debt, and you probably don't feel comfortable expressing that anger, and then that sits in you like a big lump of coal in your heart, that like, and it doesn't matter if you don't need a rational reason to be angry at someone you love dying. A feeling is a feeling, whether it's rational or not. It needs to be acknowledged and honoured.
Yeah. And you're raw and you're vulnerable when you're grieving. So if you went, I'm really angry, like I think I'm probably repeating myself. This is the thing. Luke and Luke repeating themselves. But can you remember, well, no, you're far too young actually. Kurt Cobain.
Oh, yeah. Do you know what? Like, I was going to say, this is really stupid, but when you said Kurt Cobain, I was like, I was too young, but I didn't need to be around at the time, because, whenever I was like 11, I got really into Nirvana, and it felt like whenever I found out that he died and how he died, I felt like it had just happened, and there was a lot of romanticizing going on for me for Kurt Cobain.
Yes. Well, I think it was in Seattle, whenever he died, and he had completed suicide, and it was really, he had a tour and everything coming up, and he had a very young child, and he was married to Courtney Love. And there was loads and loads of fans. This is in the 1990s, 1994 maybe, right? And as a teenager. And they were all going to Seattle, and they were all, I think, the grief, like a huge wave of grief, young people. And Courtney Love called him a bastard. She fucking called him out. She said, that bastard. She was so angry.
Yeah.
And she was like saying to the crowd, like, she was like, how did, she was not saying, he's the best thing ever. Like, she loved him dearly, but she was raw, and she was just saying, like, she was so, it was very powerful in her truth,
Yeah. And she gets some shit about that marriage too, and that's not fair, like it's not. Well, I guess that's kind of one of the difficulties of romanticizing as well, is that people see Kurt Cobain as like a perfect angel, which I'm sure even he wouldn't want to be seen as. And that makes her this evil monstrosity and things like that. And, that kind of thinking, it's only going to make life harder, not just for Courtney Love, but also for loads of spouses of people who've completed suicide, that there's that kind of cultural guilt that gets offloaded onto people because of that.
But this is something I've just thought of, right? If a lot of the time famous people or celebrities become discredited in death. Mm-hmm. Now, how? And actual, so, everyday people can be heroed, superheroed, the best person, the kindest. You couldn't have met the kinder person. You'll never meet a kinder person. He's the kindest person. She was the kindest person. And that'll be, right, in death. But a lot of the time with celebrities and famous people, that's when the fall from grace might happen.
I can only think of Jimmy Savile off the top of my head.
Jimmy Savile. Well, was there not a lot of them who were their dodgy path?
I guess, but it's understandable though. I can't name any other examples off the top of my head, but I think it's understandable that maybe people who've been victimized by a celebrity might not feel safe to come out and talk about it until they're dead, And
yes,
that's really for those people.
Well, maybe it is. Maybe it's just Jimmy Savile. I can think of. I thought there would have been more people would come out about celebrities posthumously. What is the word? Posthumously about them because it's safer.
I don't know how to pronounce it, but I know the word you're trying to post.
Yes, but maybe it's just yes. That's it. But maybe it's just he really stands out as somebody who was. No, I do think there are others, particularly men.
There probably are. We do
where people come out.
Yeah,
but that might be an era thing.
There's that too. That there's used to be a culture of silence around things like that, and in the same way that there's used to be a culture of silence around grief. I don't know, is this an urban legend that you used to be able to hire mourners to come to funerals for you and cry for you? That says to me about how unacceptable it seemed for you to be seen crying, that you had to hire somebody to do that. That's wild, isn't it? But
that is wild.
Yeah, it's all an effort to, I guess, just control the uncontrollable, which is kind of the other thing we were going to be talking about today in relation to grief. That so many clients come into therapy for things that are kind of out of their control, like death for one thing. But also, I remember one of my first ever clients was a phone client, and just how incredibly serious it was, the problem they talked about, but how little it had to do with the client. It was a family member who was mixed up in gangs, and there was drug deals and a car chase and guns and everything. And I'm embellishing this a little bit so that the story is broad enough that I'm not compromising anyone's confidentiality.
Yes.
But to me, as a trainee, that was the thing I was terrified of, because I didn't really know what I was going to do with stuff that didn't appear to be, within the client's control. But if you zoom out the lens enough, that's kind of just every client, really, isn't it? It may not be as dramatic as drug dealing, car chases, but they don't feel. Most people don't feel in control of their emotions when they're depressed, or they don't feel in control of their lives if they have an abusive partner or something like that. That kind of all therapies for stuff that's out of people's control.
Yes, and that do you know what I think a lot of the time whenever I think about my clients, I think they really want a different perspective, a different view of their life.
Yeah.
Because it's so close. And I know that for me, I actually, when I've used therapy or gone to people, it's kind of I would often go in for a head clear. The way I see it is right, okay, what do you think? Mm-hmm. And, just trying to get some clarity.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily, I suppose that makes more sense for me now with my recent diagnosis, because I would find other people and their behaviour confusing. And I know vice versa, but I would be like, I'd be like, why did they do that? They'd be like, why the fuck did she do that? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I suppose.
But it was for clarity.
Sorry, it's the delay.
No, go for it.
As a therapist with an ASD diagnosis, that you kind of provide the ultimate outside perspective in a way as well.
Yes. Do you know yes, that's what I think I do. Yeah, and often it can be like, wow, I never thought of it like that. I was like, well, that's the way. And then I've often had like, you're very honest. And I think that's why, as an Aspie, counselling is really lovely space because it's one-on-one, right? And Aspies are often they don't have their filters. They're just very honest and authentic, right? And then the client's being honest and authentic back. So there's none of this social bollocks.
Yeah. That was one of the things that Carl Rogers talked about actually in one of the 1.5 pages that I've read of On Becoming a Person, because if you've ever met a therapist who tells you on becoming a person, they're fucking lying, right? Great guy, Carl Rogers.
I've got it. I'm looking at it. Over there.
But yeah, he said
Carl Rogers. Are you slagging off Carl Rogers?
But he said that that congruence kind of begets congruence. That that's not a quote, but it's that to be honest in that level brings that honest back, because it creates that I feel safe enough to talk about this, don't you? And it kind of makes me think of whenever you're trying to get a child to admit they've done something wrong, and one of the tactics to be most successful among parents is suddenly being very, very honest and removing consequences, I suppose, as well, saying, well, I won't be mad if you tell me this, and all that stuff. But saying I used to do say this person stole something, you go, well, I used to steal stuff when I was young too. That makes them feel comfortable enough to say, okay, I did steal the thing. You know what I mean?
Oh my God, that's the other thing. With client, I have had how many parents come to me about teenagers, and they're blessed you, and teenagers. So they're coming to me losing their mind about teenagers, and this is where I'm like, right, what did they do?
Right.
And then they tell me, I'm like, oh my God. And I was like, oh my God, as a teenager, I was getting hammered in Clubland and, German teenage year. And the parents will always say to me, they'll all say to me, oh my God, I was a nightmare as a teenager. And I'm like, ta-da!
Yeah, that's really interesting. Because from what I'm hearing from teenagers, because I'm, working in a school now, and also from my own experience as a teenager, one of the big issues, I think, is that as a teenager you're in this
weird nether zone where your experience of yourself is changing second by second, and your parents are operating from a concept of you that is hopelessly out of date with every passing day. However, that concept of you is also based on, I think, 12 to 14 years of solid experience, so to them it's completely true. And it sort of leads to this feeling of not being known by parents, or not truly knowing your kid anymore. And the thing is, you're kind of both right, and you can be both wrong as well. It's a complex situation.
It just went off here. It doesn't say record. There, it's back on now.
No idea why I did that. Holy
but
shit.
You were saying about
oh shit! How long?
You were saying about
the recording's been paused, so I don't know how long we lost. Fucking hell! Zoom recording is.
And it was gold.
Yeah, it was 100%.
Remember that? Remember that podcast back in the day where it didn't record you at all?
The white whale.
So no, I don't think it's been that long, to be honest.
I don't think so.
But
you're talking about responsibility of
take it. Yes.
Do you mind if I just repeat it, because I felt it was quite good?
No, absolutely. Do repeat it, please.
I'll give it in short form. Sorry, listeners, you're going to get the short form. But okay, we talked about how, like, you know, sometimes people can talk about things in the therapy room that just seems like massive and completely out of their control, and you go, how am I going to work with this person? And I said that, you know, in any issue that somebody has at least a grain of responsibility or control over that, and that's sort of what you can work with. And I recounted a tale of how when I was, I think, 21, my first ever girlfriend had a little kiss with somebody else, and that ended that relationship. And at the time I thought, oh, what a villain, what a horrible person, she's done this to me, you know, she's the bad guy. But then if you zoom out the lens a bit and you look at responsibility, and in that relationship, you know, I can see there was a fucking million toxic things that I would have done in that relationship that probably had some part towards that, and maybe that's worth coming to terms with. And if I'd been in therapy, that's what I should have been working on, rather than sitting and going, oh, what a nasty pasty, you know, what a bitch.
I think this is brilliant, because I think you're talking about, right, humanity and flawsomeness and being flawed and forgiveness, right?
Yeah.
And you know, you were really young.
Yeah.
So you had that, and that was your first love, I presume. Yeah, I don't know, maybe it wasn't, but it was an early love, right? A very formative relationship, right? But this is where this has been a brilliant thing for me, looking about structures and society and thing, right? So your expectations were normal, right? Yeah. But there's still an element of control. Because your expectations are, we're in a monogamous relationship. If you love me, you wouldn't do that.
Right.
So there's still you behave like this. Social norm. And if you don't do that, you're a naughty person. You're a bad woman. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because of the expectations. You disappointed yourself with your own expectations.
And that I think is the difficulty that people have, is not necessarily the responsibility, but being prepared to look at your responsibility in it, you know. And I think that's probably one of the hardest things as a therapist to get a client to do, because it really takes some balls to stop somebody who's pissed off or sad about something and go, okay, but what about you? You know, what did you do?
Yes.
Because when you're pissed off, that.
And this is it. And also this is where I have had, you want them to, like, you think about it. If that relationship had continued and I'm not going to do it ever again, you're the love of my life, I love you so much, I love you, right? And then there was another transgression or indiscretion or whatever, right? And you just kept doing that. But if they're not willing to go, well, why do I have this desire? Should I be in a monogamous relationship? Maybe I really, really love Luke, but maybe this isn't for me. You know, you got to do that. You got to do, I do love, like, they can love you and think you're great and still have a roaming eye. Yeah. Actually, the roaming eye has nothing to do with the person they're in a relationship with. It's everything to do with them.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
It's always to do with us.
Yeah.
So how people treat us is a reflection of them. So that's why I think it's all very fascinating. But I know that I am not necessarily an easy person to have relationships with or be in a relationship with, because I'm quite changeable. You know, I'll be like, well, actually, the more knowledge I learn, then the way I view things have changed. So you see, now I actually, if somebody said to me years ago, they were like, I want to be with somebody else, right? We're in a committed relationship and they were like, I want to be with somebody else. Years ago, I would have gone, what's wrong with me? Why aren't you loving me? Now I'd be like, fill your boots.
Yeah.
I'm not your keeper.
Yeah. So you've sort of got a correct idea of where the responsibility is for that issue, basically. Yeah.
Yeah.
Your responsibility.
But that's because I'm like, if you do, I don't like lies. I don't like people. I wouldn't like it if they were doing that but saying they weren't, and then you find out. I really can't stand that. But I am all for open and honest dialogue and open and honest conversation. Even things you don't want to hear. That's unconditional love. That is pure love. It's not you're the best thing ever, here's 12 roses. It's like, you know what? I don't feel really good at this moment. It's really getting through the really difficult stuff and having the difficult conversations and forgiving people for being arseholes sometimes.
Yeah.
That's love. Whereas that's where that's love. Accepting people and, working with people to try and help them through dark times, as opposed to going, you're an assy asshole.
Right. Yeah.
You've annoyed me.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
It makes me think of there's like
what do you think?
The Stoic philosophers. So they're like the guys who, the ancient Greek dudes who were basically doing CBT before it was CBT, and they had this exercise called the locus of control, and basically it's like a little circle, and the things that are in your control are in that, and that is literally just your thoughts and your actions. And I guess I would maybe add your feelings in it a little bit. I think you have partial control over your feelings in your life, but like those are literally the three things you have control over, whereas everything else, like other people's actions, what other people are doing, that is outside of that bubble. You don't have control over that. And I sometimes have to do that with myself in my head with clients, but whenever the focus is being drawn to just how much of a dickhead somebody in a client's life is, and they're trying to sort of draw attention away from them, there's like a little phrase that I would sometimes use where I would say, well, that's all well and good, but that person isn't in therapy here with me right now. And, you can say that lightheartedly enough.
Yes.
You sort of, cut off the thread of being wrapped up in the dickhead story without being a dickhead yourself, Yeah.
Yeah. I can't, that's clients who are constantly looking at others and how they've been wronged and how, I can feel wronged by people, but I also know that if you want relationships to work, you have to both put in the work. There has to be exactly what you've said. There has to be a meeting in the middle. There has to be some give. There cannot, if you are just like, you're wrong and I'm always right and you're always wrong, that is really unhealthy. That's an unhealthy relationship. That's a controlling relationship.
I guess
if somebody's like incapable of saying they're wrong, go for it.
Well, the flip side, isn't it, as well, is it's often something you'd see in abused partners, but also like in general of taking too much responsibility, like taking responsibility for things that are completely out of your control, like basically. I mean, I guess in an abusive relationship, that would be, I'm sorry about what you're saying about having a wandering eye. I'm sorry that I occasionally look at other people because, you don't really have control over feeling like attracted to other people or looking around at the world. And also, I like some things I'm hearing from clients is that maybe somebody's like offended you and you've quietly wished them dead or wished them ill, and then something bad happens to them. You feel responsible for that. That like, yeah, that's taking too much responsibility. That's taking responsibility for things that weren't in your control. Maybe for a second you felt like they were in your control, and that's what leads to that sort of unnecessary guilt. I read this great short story by the psychoanalyst Stephen Gross last night. It's in a book called The Examined Life, which is I really recommend reading for therapists and non-therapists alike. But basically he posited in this story that sometimes people can take responsibility for big things that are out of their control so that they don't have to acknowledge little things that were within their control. So it was somebody who I think it was maybe to do with, I can't remember, somebody who felt responsible for a natural disaster because they've been having negative thoughts or something like that, when really they were taking responsibility for that so that they wouldn't have to take responsibility for saying something hurtful to their sister, Oh,
projections.
Well, yeah, it is like a projection. It's like, I'm sorry that I've done all this so that I don't have to say I'm sorry for the thing I actually should be sorry for,
Yeah. I've recently been thinking about that because a podcast I've been listening to more recently is The Jungian Life.
Oh yeah, I like that.
And they were talking about the what?
No, I like them. They're great. Yeah.
What do you think?
The podcast.
They're so like this the whole time.
Yeah.
Everybody's so California, really chilled. I love it. Then I'm like, what the hell? I'm like, well, but anyway, what was I saying about them? Yeah, they were talking about projections, and they were saying about how a woman had come who was madly in love with, she was completely madly in love with somebody who was, who she worked with, but it was never going anywhere. It was like a relationship. She was just obsessed with them. She was tormenting herself. He was married. She was married. It wasn't going anywhere. And just they and the Jungian analyst was saying, I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know what it meant. And then they finally realized what it meant. It seemed quite obvious. It was because it was easier for her to think of this unrequited love situation, this completely romantic, unrequited love, ridiculous situation, than to actually come to terms and be honest with how miserable she was in her marriage.
Yeah.
So
that makes a lot of sense.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my God, I think I do that a lot on certain things. I think I will go rather than, and that made me go more, okay, because I feel quite content in a lot of my life, but there's sometimes I'll be like, no, that like other structures or other things will annoy me, because they're easier to be annoyed at them than it is to really look at the relationships, or you know what I mean? So I would say that more like my kids, my kids, it's easier for me to actually say things outside are wrong, as opposed to go, right, this needs to change in this house. Things need to change here. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I guess what you're saying is it's like difficult to know the difference between when something requires individual change or systemic change.
Yeah, well, I just thought it was brilliant. And then when this woman actually realized what she'd been doing, how she'd been this, she'd been this unrequited love scenario that was consuming so much of her brain and her psyche and everything, this archetype, and it was connected with archetypes, how it was when it became, actually she realized this is actually not about that really gorgeous man who I work with, who I don't actually know that well, and probably if I share my life with him I think he's an idiot, because she'd romanticize it so much, because it was too painful to look at the marriage and to say, well, this marriage, there's not a lot of love, and we're coexisting. It's not. And I just thought that was brilliant. And that, I do think that's connected to grief, because she was grieving her marriage when she was in it. And that's something that I am very familiar with, grieving the end of relationships when the people are still here.
Right. Wow. Yeah, I guess that's a good point. People talk about how they could tell when a partner was about to end a relationship, and maybe it's because that's visible. Like they're grieving, they're grieving that relationship just being about to end, or what they have to do.
Yes. Well, how long has this podcast been?
I think we've been just over an hour. I think we're probably we've probably done an episode. Yeah, it's a really weird way to end an episode. To go, that's long enough. Away on.
Yeah. No. We can do longer. Like we I'm just joking. Try and end it more smoothly.
Well, I guess we could wrap up with you. It was a little thought that I had recently when I was speaking to like a family member. Some family members who are sort of semi-involved in politics over the water and things like that, and environmental impact. And particularly for people in politics, I think there's this. It just makes you think of responsibility and life meaning, because there's this focus on like impact. It's like I need to have a maximum amount of impact on the world. I need to be responsible for this many lives being saved and this amount of CO2 being removed from the atmosphere, and incredibly noble stuff, but probably quite damaging in the long term, because then if you focus too much on your impact, then that means you can't really sit down. You see enjoying yourself as dead time when you could be fixing the world and things like that. And it's probably not super helpful for you. And to me, I think the cure is kind of in finding comfort and joy in small acts of impact. So I may not be removing tons of CO2 from the atmosphere, but sometimes I go for a walk and I pick up some litter that I recycle, or I water my plants in the back garden, and like that is also doing its part towards removing CO2 from the atmosphere. Nowhere near as much, but like it's about, if you try and see all your impacts as equal, you will be less anxious, I think. I feel like that's probably a good note to end on. And
that is, well, that's my subject. You bring up my research and you're like, that's us done. Cut her up. No, turn her mic off. Turn it off.